Hi, it's Steve Hargadon, and welcome to the second and final day of the 2014 Homeschool Plus Conference. Lori Lane is here. I'm going to run through a couple of quick slides before she starts. Thanks to Homeschool Life G3 and Home Education Magazine for support and promotion of the conference, and thanks to Blackboard Collaborate for this terrific and stable platform. We have one live attendee, Anya. If you want to the left of the map now, you should be able to see some icons. You're looking for the star icon. You click on it twice and then click on the map. I'm in Asheville, North Carolina. Lori, where are you?
I'm in Colorado.
Nice. And Anya, if you hear us, then you can put in the chat or click on the map and let us know where you're listening from. Maybe you'll make us an international audience. Okay, Lori, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Steve. We are having a session this morning quite early, and I appreciate Steve's flexibility with me this morning with a change of schedule for me last minute due to some interesting circumstances in my life, but you know, that's kind of what homeschooling is about, is a series of interesting circumstances. We're going to be talking this morning about homeschooling beginning with the end in mind, or beginning again with the end in mind, as the case may be, depending on whether or not you are just starting out homeschooling, or you have been homeschooling for a while and need to kind of readjust your sails and catch a second wind. Many of the speakers, from what I can tell and what I've been listening in on over the last couple of days, have been talking a lot about some of the more technical aspects of homeschooling, methodologies, philosophies, technology. This particular session is going to be geared more towards I would say the logistics, the day-to-day aspect of homeschooling and the challenges that homeschooling parents often find themselves in, and maybe a few key points on how to overcome those challenges in order to continue on this journey that we call home education. You know, I'm not done with homeschooling yet, but after 20 years of doing it, I'm beginning to see a little light at the end of the tunnel. The last of our four sons is a rising junior this year, and what began as a journey which found me pretty much grasping at straws and groping in the dark has now kind of come full circle. And I know that I don't have all the answers, and honestly nobody does, and that's part of what this conference is about, is sharing the different answers and different thoughts and the different ideas that each of us has run across or come up with or recognized or realized during our journey. But if anybody ever tells you that they have all of the answers for homeschooling, it's really not the case. But after 20 years, I do have some experience in my back pocket and 3 homeschool graduates under my belt. I will tell you that I will share with you that they did graduate with some holes in their education. Yep, they did. And but am I happy with the men that they've become? Yes. John and I have four boys ranging in age now from 28 down to 16. And it may have been 20 years since we started this homeschool journey, but I can still remember how overwhelming it seemed and how confused I was and how frustrated I became with just the first few decisions that I found myself faced with. You know, over the years, I've watched hundreds of families start a homeschool journey or home educating journey with their children. And I've seen them start with hope and expectation, and only to be filled with misery and confusion just a few short months later. And I've even found myself in that situation from time to time. And I really have a heart for these families, a heart that wants to encourage you today and not to overcomplicate this thing that we call home education, but rather to find your philosophy, your methodology, and your comfort and encouragement by beginning with the end in mind. Now, in doing that, I want to be able to share with you just a few aspects of our own homeschool journey as a family, not because we have all the answers and not because we've done it perfectly. I still have my occasional meltdown and wondering if I'm doing the right thing, but I'm going to be sharing with you warts, wonders, and all. So hopefully that you'll leave this session being encouraged. You know, I'm a pretty independent and stubborn woman, somewhat of a maverick, I guess. So I hate sometimes being told not to begin something until I've thought through it from the beginning to the end. I'm more of a dive in and think about it later sort of gal. Sometimes diving in will actually work, and sometimes it's even the best way to do things, but more often than not, diving in leaves me coming up out of the water gasping for air. And for those big projects, those projects in life that really matter, beginning with the end in mind is a principle that is time-tested and true, and there is no project that matters more than the education of your children, the development of your children, both from an emotional, mental, and spiritual aspect. And by beginning with the end in mind, we can have a compass or a guidepost that provides us with parameters that will guide our decisions on a big and a small picture basis as we home educate our children. And I have a visual reminder, something that gives me something that I can put my hands on when I get discouraged or when I get sidetracked, that I can go back and I can read and I can have written out some of these aspects of what I'm beginning with the end in mind. Now, what do I mean by beginning with the end in mind? Well, the principle of beginning with the end in mind simply means to think through what you want a, quote, project to look like when it's completed. And then based on that desired end result, plan your approach to that project accordingly. Now that seems like a pretty simple thing to do. However, in this day and age when life seems to move really, really fast, and with our lives that face the pressures to do and perform rather than to take the time to think through things, beginning with the end in mind is a habit that has to be developed as a homeschooling parent or as a home educator or as an alternative educator. We have to know where we're headed as we begin the journey. And that process of beginning with the end in mind doesn't always happen naturally for many of us, but it is so worth it. Let me explain to you just really quickly. I don't want to spend too much time on personal example, but I do want to personalize this a little bit because whenever I speak around the country and in different locations, in different environments and scenarios, I find that oftentimes by talking or sharing with you some personal examples, you can think of things in your own life that pertain to that same type of scenario. You know, I never ever planned to home educate my children, ever. I was the product of a private school education. My husband was a public school graduate. My mom had been a teacher in a traditional classroom for years. My husband's mother had worked in the public school system for years. Homeschooling had never even crossed my mind. I didn't even know there was such a thing. But then I received a phone call. You know, that kind of call that reminds you of your own school days. I spent many afternoons and many hours in the principal's office growing up because I was one of those exuberant students that couldn't sit still, couldn't be quiet. And now I was a parent of 2 boys at that time, and I got a call from the principal of their school summoning me into the principal's office just like I had been when I was a student. Naturally now, since these were my first 2 boys, I was still a young mother, and the thought of being asked to come in and discuss my boys totally struck fear into my heart. I could not imagine what was wrong. So I complied, and I found myself in the principal's office having a sit-down conference with the principal and both of the boys' teachers, 2 separate teachers. And as I sat there through the conference, I heard several things spoken to me from the principal and the teachers that left me really pondering and wondering about education, traditional education in general. First of all, I was told that my 2nd grader I would have to choose between either moving him up to 3rd grade with his class, but I was told that there was concern that he would fall behind because of a transition to a more, what would you call, lecture-style teaching in the 3rd grade. Now, in my mind, I quietly had this violent reaction to the idea of lecture-style teaching in the 3rd grade, but I held my tongue and I continued to listen. The other choice I was given was to have that same child repeat 2nd grade, but I was told that there was concern that he would be bored because it was evident to the teacher that he was grasping the concepts, but he was just having trouble expressing those concepts in a written, traditional format. Now, I'll also want to give you a background that I had chosen to have my boys enrolled in a very small school where the class limit was 8 students in a classroom for one teacher. So in that class setting, in a small class setting like that with a maximum class size of 8, I wondered why in the world the teacher couldn't adapt her assessment style for a different style of learner. But again, because I was this first-time mother, I continued to hold my tongue. Then much to my surprise, I was also told we needed to discuss my 1st grade son. Well, this conference seemed to be getting better by the minute, of course, and my 1st grade son, to the teacher, appeared bored in class and seemed to be easily frustrated and even angered by his peers when they did not grasp the concept as quickly as he did. And once again, in my young mother mind, I wondered why in the world in a class of 8 the teacher could not adapt teaching styles, projects, and materials to meet the needs of the individual student. There was talk of moving this child, my 1st grader, up a grade, and I found myself imagining the dilemma that would put me in as I tried to explain this to my 2 sons who were the best of friends, who were a year apart, but now would be in the same grade. So I wrestled with what to do. And John and I really began to pray and read and talk, and we happened to stumble on the idea of homeschooling through a book called For the Children's Sake by Susan Schaefer Macaulay. And I thought to myself, how hard could this possibly be with the boys being so young? In my mind, I envisioned a little schoolroom in our house with desks and a chalkboard and an American flag and a teacher's desk and bookcases lined with all sorts of educational games and books. Yep, that's it. I was going to do school at home. So you see, my start to homeschooling was pretty inauspicious. I didn't feel convicted to homeschool. I didn't make the decision out of concern for their spiritual well-being. I didn't decide to homeschool based on their safety at that time. I simply decided to homeschool based on the unmet educational needs of my children. There wasn't any writing on the wall. There wasn't any banner in the sky. It was a practical decision. Well, at that time, my husband, John, wasn't exactly jumping up and down on the homeschool bandwagon, but he was supportive because we simply couldn't figure out what else to do. We had bright boys whose needs were not being met in a private school. So we began to talk about homeschooling, and it was then, and only then, that we began to realize how powerful this approach could be. In the course of our conversations and in the course of studying this aspect of home educating and of being able to individualize an education for our children, we began to realize several things. First, we began to realize we could tailor-make each of our sons' educations based on their strengths, their weaknesses, their interests, and their desires, and it could be totally out of the box. Secondly, we could schedule their education around our family instead of our family around their education. Third, we could impart our values to them by taking advantage of those teachable moments that happen when you least expect them. Fourth, we could adjust the teaching style to match the learning style of each of our children. Next, we could camp out on topics of interest to our children. And last but not least, we would have time to teach to their heart, to instill character qualities that we felt were important to the development of our sons. Bottom line, we began to realize that if we developed goals, if we could begin this journey of home education with the end in mind, And if we knew what we wanted to accomplish, then the choices that we would face along the journey of home education would almost be pre-made. So based on that fact, we began to talk about what we felt were the most important things for our children to know, to have instilled, to have learned from us before they left our home. In other words, we began to draw in our minds a picture of what we felt like the boys would need when they left our home in order to be what we like to call fully equipped. Now for us, for our family, this meant really not only searching through educational journals and philosophies and methodologies, but it also meant for us as a family beginning with a biblical foundation of education, because I wanted to know for sure where we were headed. You know, without a foundation, and for us, without a biblical foundation upon which to make decisions regarding education of our children, we can often be tossed about by all the newest things that are coming out, or the public opinion, or peer pressure, or tradition. And so we really began to write these things down, to talk through them, to draw a mental picture, and then to document what we were talking about. As we began to study, we began also to realize that some of the influences of my own education, of our education growing up, had influenced our approach to homeschooling. It had influenced our priorities, our methods, and what we felt like was acceptable as far as education. So we really had to back up and start from the beginning, kind of start with a clear slate to develop our own philosophy of education based on a foundation. You know, by this time in our lives and journey in home educating, we've been homeschooling, I guess, for about 2 years by the time we began to realize that this tradition, bringing school home, was not exactly where it was at. But we were expecting our third son by this time, and in addition to my husband's full-time job in downtown Atlanta at that time, we had a side business. Life was busy. So we began to write these things down so that we would have something to refer back to. And pretty soon, those pieces, that foundation, began to fall into place. I don't know if you've been homeschooling long enough or have been around home education long enough to realize it yet or not, but you are going to need to make these decisions based on what is best for your children. Our choices, our decisions, our convictions, our priorities, and our goals for our children are just that. They're ours. And I quickly learned that there is just as much pressure as peer pressure within homeschooling as there is within any other area of life. And I had to guard against being unduly influenced by what others were choosing, because bottom line, I was home educating my children to meet the needs of each individual child within my home. And because of that, my choices were going to look different than other people's choices. So although I may differ with another home educator on what is the best curriculum, the best approach, or the proper priorities, and those differences can sometimes be unsettling, if I have begun my journey with the end in mind, and I know what I want that end to look like, I have to keep that in mind and keep those goals in front of us, so that there are some things that are absolutely non-negotiable. And, you know, after we graduated our first 2 boys, which has been now 9 and 10 years ago, I went back and I looked at that list of non-negotiables, those end results that we had started with. And it was really encouraging. But something I realized was that the funny thing was, on that list of non-negotiables, are those goals for what the boys would have gotten from our home education experience. We hadn't listed in the top 10 high SAT or ACT scores. We hadn't listed being MVP on the local sports team or being the star in the local theater. But what did appear on the list were things that centered on the hearts of our children, on the idea of educating them individually, of finding out what their strengths and weaknesses were and equipping them to be all that God had called them to be, or all that God had created them to be. So, one of the things that we could not seem to rest on is the idea of them being fully equipped. There's a word in the Greek that's Rtos. It's actually found one time in the Bible as well, in 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17, where it's describing someone as being fully equipped. And that is what we wanted to do. We wanted to have our boys leave our home fully equipped. And the question then is, as you begin your homeschool journey, or as you begin this year's new leg of the homeschool journey, if you've been doing this a while, the question is, what does fully prepared, what does Rtos look like for your child? And that's something only you can answer. And that's the beauty of home education, is you can look at your child and say, what are his strengths? What are his weaknesses? Where can I shore that up? What are his interests? Where can I feed that natural curiosity and that learning with my child? And how can I create a lifelong learner? How can I create somebody with the type of character qualities that we want them to leave our home with? So that's a question, I think, that is a bottom line question, an essential question for each of us to ask as we begin our homeschool journey, beginning with the end in mind, is to ask, what does fully prepared look like for my child? And when we can answer that, and when we can document that and write that out, then we've really started to focus in on what's going to be important in the education of each one of our children within our home. When our third son was just beginning to walk, I looked up from the couch one day and I saw him doing that kind of toddler teeter move, and he was standing at the top of the stairs, that time where they're kind of weaving back and forth, and they're just about to tumble at any moment. Well, knowing that he was going to tumble down the stairs at any moment, I leaped up from the couch and I jumped over all those toys that were all over the floor, and I was at the top of the stairs before you could say lickety-split. I didn't stop to think about the book I had to lay aside, or the toys that served as an obstacle in the path, or the number of stairs I had to climb to get to him on time. My focus was on what I wanted to do, to accomplish, and it was so crystal clear that I didn't notice the obstacles in our path. I hope you're making the connection now to this beginning with the end in mind. When I know where I'm going, the obstacles that we're all going to face as we home educate our children, whether that's peer pressure or finances or learning challenges or health issues or whatever limitations come our way, it's very much the same thing. I can guarantee you that we will experience obstacles in our path towards helping our children be fully prepared. The obstacles that I've experienced may not be the same as the ones you're experienced, but I've certainly had a variety of them. And I want to share with you a few of those obstacles and how beginning with the end in mind has helped us stay focused over the last 20 years of homeschooling. One of those obstacles that many parents face, whether they've got their children in a traditional classroom or an alternative classroom or they're home educating, is the idea of learning challenges. Now again, remember, you've begun your homeschool journey, or you're going to begin it again by continuing and constantly defining what it looks like to have your child be Rtos, fully prepared. And early on in our journey, we were aware that we had some learning differences. That's what I like to call them in our children. We've had 3 that struggled with dyslexia, 1 that struggled with audio integration, another struggled with small motor skills, another be diagnosed with ADD, and another be labeled gifted. So this definitely threw us for a time. we had to ask ourselves questions like, did we want to have our child tested? Did we want to use medication? Did we want to learn various therapies and coping strategies? And it was all very overwhelming. Coming out on the other side of those questions, I can tell you what we've learned along the way and how beginning with the end in mind helped us stay focused. First of all, study your child. If he has a learning disability or a learning difference or a learning challenge, find out, again, what his strengths and weaknesses are. Find out what makes him excited, what grabs his interest. Find out what he fears. Find out what gives him confidence. For one of our children, he totally loved computers. So this was, years ago now. Would go from garage sale to garage sale, spending his money on used computer parts so that he could come back home and build them. Nobody taught him how to do this. He just figured it out on his own. Another son that was interested in entertainment, whether it was film or video or speaking to people on stage. Another one that had a definite gift for working with animals. And another one that had a definite gift with music. You study your child and you find out what makes his boat float. And by doing so, you can find out where his areas of strength are, even when they have learning challenges. And focus in on those learning, those abilities, those strengths, those areas of interest to help them build their confidence. Read about the areas that you're concerned about. If you suspect dyslexia or ADD or other challenges, read up on them. However, be careful what you read and who you read, and that who you are reading with lines up with the philosophy that you believe is right for your family. If appropriate, seek out testing so that you can identify an issue and choose appropriate strategies to address that issue. Again, remember, their recommendations need to line up with what you feel like is right with your child, right for your child. Always be open to new ideas and strategies, but do remember that you know your child best. Remember that God gave that child to you because He knew that with His help and strength and grace, you could parent that child to be Rtos, to be all that God had created him to be. So embrace that. Be empowered by that. Let's talk about another area that can sometimes sidetrack people if we're not beginning with the end in mind. And again, I'm not talking today about a lot of technical issues. What I wanted to do in this session is to encourage you to know your child, to know what you want to accomplish with your child, and then to be able to overcome many of the obstacles that you may end up facing along your home education journey. Another area is financial limitations. There were times during our journey that we experienced financial limitations, and during some times it just wasn't limitations, it was sheer extreme financial stress. And I will admit that I didn't always handle that type of stress well. In fact, more often than not, I kind of failed that test. I kicked and I struggled against the restraints or those boundaries that I was having to operate within. And in my mind, I told myself that I was struggling because I wanted to provide the best for our children. And that is a noble and a lofty goal and a desire. And in many ways, that was very true and very understandable considering the struggles that I was facing. But really at the root of my kicking and screaming under that financial limitation was the fact that I really didn't like being told what I could and couldn't do. But once I kind of laid down that rebellious heart, I found that it was during times of financial limitations that I found my greatest creativity in home education. When I couldn't afford the materials and the books that I wanted to buy, so I had to think of ways to do something, that same activity or accomplish that same desired end result we've been talking about, but do it in a way that didn't cost as much. I began to use those creative juices that all of us have been given. I learned to use the library, and I reserved books well in advance of our needing them. I learned to use Amazon and online used book sales and used curriculum sales to get textbooks that I couldn't do without. I looked for free online sources. I shared books and classes and instruction with friends who had similar goals and interests, and we would pool our ideas together. I would find friends who had expert background in chemistry or an expert background in math, things that I struggled with, and they would know that my expertise was in the arts and in the liberal arts, in history and literature, music, theater, and art, and we would band together. I bartered my services in order to allow my children to participate in various activities that cost money that I couldn't spend. And I taught group classes myself. That was actually how Rtos Academy was started. You may have noticed at the beginning of this session that I direct a program called Rtos Academies. It is an integrated program for history, literature, music, theater, and art, as well as academic instruction in science and math. But our specialty is in the liberal arts and in the fine arts. And we study those particular areas from an integrated historical and creative method or philosophy, so that all of those different areas of study are synergizing with one another. And none of those subject areas are standalone, but the child is learning from real life examples on how these things have affected each other, how they've influenced one another, and how they work together in real life. And educational studies will tell you over and over again that when a child understands how what they're learning interacts with real life, that is where engagement comes. And Rtos was started because of the desired end result that John and I had for our boys. Excuse me. We had one that was interested in theater, one that was interested in film, one that was interested in music, one that was interested in art. And because of this, we were looking around for a program at that time in the Atlanta area that would meet the needs of our children. Much of that was either unaffordable, or it was a philosophy I didn't agree with, or the standard of excellence in those programs was not what we were looking for. And it was out of the need of our own children that Rtos Academies was developed. And what a blessing that's been. You know, so many home education programs or curriculums have been developed because of the need of somebody's own children. So don't limit yourself just because you have financial restraints. Realize that this is a time to be creative, to think outside of the box. Another area that home educators often struggle with, and that will sidetrack you if you're not beginning with the end in mind, is health limitations. You know, more than once during this journey of 20 years so far, I have been faced with extended periods of health limitations. I mean, right now we're getting ready to kick off the year, and thank goodness Steve was flexible with me today. I had an accident, a climbing accident, and so I think we may even have to postpone us getting school started a little bit this year because of a health limitation. For both our third and fourth sons, I had troubled pregnancies and was confined to bed. All sorts of different things happen along the way of a homeschool journey, and it was hard for me to accept help from others during that time, much less ask for help. Thankfully, people helped anyway, and I learned some much-needed humility in the process. But health limitations can really sidetrack you. It was during these times of being limited by health or being limited by the amount of physical activity that I could do that, again, I had to look at what was my desired end result. What was I trying to accomplish with home education? What did fully prepared, or RTOs, look like for my children? And then based on that end result, that desired end result, that goal, I would shift my plans. It may not look like I thought it was going to look, but I would still be making progress towards that end result. So during times like that, we did lots of read-alouds. We watched lots of educational videos, literature-related videos. played educational games, all from my semi-permanent position on the couch or in the bed. And I learned not to be quite so pridefully independent and stubborn. If you've been home educating for any length of time, you realize that it's not always just about the academics or the achievements or the learning, the traditional type of learning. It also has to do with life skills and important life lessons. And during these times, I believe our boys learn some important life skills and home-related skills simply out of necessity. And the two that are married have wives that thank me profusely for that. They also had to watch us learn to work together as a team, husband, wife, and children. And they saw the way a community works when somebody is not able to perform or do their regular duties, and how the importance of being a member of a community works. And this is something I think that's often lost in today's busy society, the importance of community. You know, during health limitations, sometimes we did school at odd hours, and even content and emphasis were adjusted so that we could take advantage of teachable moments that were occurring due to the specific circumstances that were happening on that day. But we could do that because we knew what our desired end result was. We knew what we believed fully prepared would look like for both John, Jeremy, Jared, and Jordan. Again, it was the idea of having a clear picture of where we were headed that helped us adjust our sails to adjust our paths. I love this quote: set your goals in concrete and your plans in sand. For us, home education was going to be a long journey. We had children that were spread out over a number of years, but we wanted to be able to continue to meet our goals. Sometimes just those plans needed to adjust in order to meet those goals. Another sometimes challenging obstacle or opportunity, whatever the day may bring for that particular day, is the idea of, I want to read this screen right here. It was the beauty of having a clear picture of a desired end result that allowed us to flex without breaking, to adapt to the situation, and to still continue to move forward toward our goal. Hope this is I hope this is making sense. Okay, let's go back here. Another obstacle that we sometimes face is the idea that we have multiple children with multiple ages. At one point in time, I had a middle schooler, a high schooler, a child in elementary, and a child in preschooler. And we hadn't exactly planned it that way, but that was the reality of it. And I'm not going to lie to you, there were days when I couldn't figure out what stage of life I was actually in. Most of my friends had kids that were fairly close in age, so from my perspective, they were in a specific stage of child rearing or home education. I, however, have spent the last 20 years feeling like I was all over the place. There was no way I could not teach, there was no way that I could not approach home education in some sort of integrated format where we were combining the study of different things, age appropriately, of course, and according to their skill and development. But we had to do it in an integrated format. It was out of sheer necessity and the need to keep my sanity that we began to immerse our family in a specific historical time period for our study of history, literature, and the arts. Sure, the discussion and approach was made to fit the needs of each child, but I didn't have to juggle multiple history and literature texts. The decision to approach history and literature in that way was in and of itself revolutionizing for our home and home education, and it relieved so much stress. And it made for a community of learning within our home, so that when we sat down at the dinner table, because we were all studying the same time period, or we had been reading the same book, or we had been listening to the same music, the topics of discussion at our dinner table were synergistic. We were bouncing ideas off of one another. The younger kids were learning from the older kids. The older kids were learning to see something through a younger child's eyes. It was an amazing, amazing learning opportunity for them and for me. During times when it was necessary for us to have individual learning sessions, there were times when I would assign an older sibling to read to the younger boys, or to play an educational game, or watch an assigned video. Audiobooks and stories were also a great way of keeping some of the younger children occupied when I needed to work with one specific child. It didn't always work, but of course keeping an eye on where we desired to end up at the end of our homeschool journey, what each child needed to have accomplished or have learned in order to be fully equipped, helped me flex through the challenges of having multiple age children and to still remain on track. Another obstacle or challenge that happens often with homeschoolers is the lack of community and isolation. I love this verse in Ecclesiastes that says, though one may be overpowered, two can defend themselves. A cord of three strands is not quickly broken. And you as a home educator, whether you are a home educating father or mother, family, or your children, they still need community. Community is much more, it's much broader than just socialization. We all know that story. If you've been home educating, you've been asked that question. It always makes me giggle, but that's a whole other comment. I think my children are probably the most over-socialized kids in the face of the planet. But even in business, they have things called mastermind groups. You have all sorts of community groups that get together to synergize, to learn together. Oftentimes a homeschool family, or a homeschool mom in particular, can sometimes become isolated from online, from people that would be able to encourage her. This is really, really important to understand that community is very important. It helps you stay focused. It helps you have somebody as a sounding board. For those of you who live in a rural community like I do, these online type of conferences are amazing opportunities to hear from other people that are home educating, or who have been home educating, or who have new ideas that you'd like to learn about. There are online communities. One that I'm familiar with, that I actually am the editor for, is Heart of the Matter Online. You can find that on heartofthematteronline.com, where there are articles and communities that you can participate in, conferences, etc., that you can continue to have your community. Because if you only isolate yourselves or isolate your children, a spirit of discouragement or disillusionment or cynicism can breed in and of itself within isolationism. So be careful to build community in whatever way works for you and for your family, because that will be one of the areas that will sidetrack you if you're not beginning with the end in mind. Okay, I'm going to fast forward through just a little bit. Last but not least, I think the last thing I'm going to cover here in this particular session is the sidetrack of moving. Many homeschool families will end up having to move, or home educating families move. I hate the time that it takes to pack and unpack, and the distraction that it is to the things I want to do as a family. However, sometimes moving is something that can't be avoided. Again, this is just one of the things that I've experienced that would sidetrack me from the end result, that desired end result that I had. And I found that if I included the boys in on some of those decisions in the process, included with packing and unpacking, I could get settled more quickly. They understood what it took to move a family. They understood, again, the sense of community, the sense of working together as a team. And I was able to suspend school until we got settled, and then to start right back up again. all of these things can serve as distractions or they can serve as opportunities. The thing that decides whether or not it's going to be a distraction or an opportunity is whether or not you have developed what your end result is, beginning with the end in mind. Now, lest you think that's something you have to have all in place before you even begin your homeschool journey, let me just suggest this. Beginning with the end in mind is a continual process. That's why this session is titled Beginning or Beginning Again with the End in Mind. This year, when we start up after Labor Day, we will be starting our 21st year of homeschooling. And once again, I'm beginning again with the end in mind. I'm reassessing what happened last year. I'm continuing to study this last and final boy that I still have at home, continuing to watch him hone his interests and his gifts and his skill so that I can begin this year again with the desired end result of preparing him to be fully equipped for everything that God has called him and created him to be. So all of these things can be mountains or molehills, little bumps. It depends on where our focus is. You remember that illustration I used a few minutes ago about my son being at the top of the stairs and me leaping over the toys and throwing the book aside and bounding up the stairs in time to keep him from falling simply because I wasn't looking at the toys on the floor. I wasn't worried about where the book landed. I wasn't worried about how many steps were in front of me. I was focused on that child at the top of the stairs. And that's how the home education journey is. That was what it means to begin with the end in mind. I'm not looking at the obstacles. I'm looking at where I want to go, and how I get there will often change, like goals in concrete, plans in sand. But that a constant adjusting will happen if I'm focused on that desired end result. One last thing that I want to mention, just briefly, is new trends, opportunities, and groups. You know, one thing I've noticed is over the last 20 years is home educating moms want to do the right thing. We want to do what's best for our children. We want to make the right choices. And there's nothing wrong with looking to make sure that we are not missing something out there. But oftentimes I found myself making choices based on the wrong things. Instead of making a decision to participate in a program based on my desired end result, sometimes I've gotten caught up in what somebody else I know and respect is doing versus what's best for my children, or what the peer pressure is, or what the newest trend is. Not taking time to realize how it will affect my kids, but simply out of fear, out of peer pressure, out of tradition, whatever. And I just would encourage you to always, when you're getting ready to plan your year, when you're getting ready to make a decision to be involved or not be involved in a particular activity or use a particular curriculum, go back to what your desired end result is, to what you have begun this journey as with the end in mind. Such an important concept. I'm going to close with just this verse here, and whether or not you Scripture is your compass, this verse is such apropos to this particular session. A double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. One thing that homeschool moms get frustrated with or that get strung out about is because they're looking so many different ways they can't ever make a decision because they have forgotten what their desired end result is. So if we can have that desired end result, the decisions are almost already made for us. I'd love to stay in touch with you. There are some additional workshops that I have available free of charge on my website that you're welcome to use. Some of them are more technical. Today, I just wanted to encourage you. This is that time of year when it's important for us to refocus again on what we want to accomplish with our children and why we want to accomplish it. And so this wasn't exceptionally technical. It was meant to be more encouraging. But we have some additional workshops that are available on my website, which is called, believe it or not, theendinmind.net. And I'd love to have you visit over there and keep in touch with me that way. If you'd like to know a little bit more about Rtos Academies and this, what we like to call a new way of educating, which is an integrated and wholehearted approach to creative learning, you can learn more about that by going to A New Way of Educating, anewwayoфeducating.com. I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. I think we do that through the chat conversation. Is that right? If not, I'm happy to do it another way.
And I'll give this, just two in the room, I'll give them each microphone privileges as well. If they want to just turn their talk button on, they can ask a question. So Autumn or Lisa, you're welcome to put a question in the chat or just turn your microphone on. Lisa has no questions. No questions, great. Okay. Twitter handle. The Twitter handle is Rtos, A-R-T-I-O-S, L Lane for Lori Lane. Well, Steve, I just want to thank you again for being flexible with me this morning. I know that it affected you more than you will admit, and I so appreciate that and appreciate your good wishes for me as I continue to recuperate. Yes, you do have those good wishes, and you're obviously a seasoned presenter, and you did a great job. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much.